Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net, and in this very special video, what I'm going to be showing you is how to draw the female head from the top-down perspective in the front view. Now, if you check out the full lesson for this particular demonstration on Skillshare, I'll post the link below. We'll also cover the female head from the bottom-up perspective as well, how to construct it, how to refine it, and ultimately bring both these views through to completion as a polished, professional looking illustration. I'm going to take you through the entire process from laying down the initial foundations, placing in the facial features, making sure they're all proportionally accurate and structured correctly within these more dynamic angles. It's kind of tricky because the shape of the facial features and the head itself actually changes as it becomes foreshortened within these different perspectives. And we're going to take that draft and bring it through to completion through strategically placing line weights in order to really polish up the key contours within the artwork, and then placing in some rendering using cross-hatching techniques where we'll really start to articulate the subtle forms within the face itself, and then the texture and the form of the hair, and really articulating that in a convincing way. So I hope that you really enjoy this lesson and that you get a ton of information out of it. Again, if you enjoy what you see here with the top-down perspective of the female head, be sure to check out the full lesson on Skillshare by clicking the link below. Now we're going to jump into some trickier views for this demonstration, and with these more dynamic angles, a solid foundation becomes even more important. So we're still using the same fundamental building blocks to construct a basic head. We've got a sphere for the cranium, used to get the scale and positioning of the head sorted to begin with. Then we have the face, which is built off of that. And of course from there we plot out where the facial features are going to go, except this time, looking at the female head from the top down and bottom up, the proportions of the face are going to become foreshortened. As a result, we see some pretty significant changes, not only with where the features are going to be placed, but how they'll be shaped along with the shape of the head itself. Because as the head turns downward away from us or upward, everything becomes skewed by the perspective. Luckily, in these examples, we're looking at the up and down tilt from the front, so we're only really seeing the effects of that foreshortening along the vertical axes. Even so, it's a tricky situation to navigate around, but we'll do our best here. With the foundations down, we're ready to draw in the facial features, starting with the eyes. I always start with the eyes because I think they're important, especially for women. A woman's eyes are mesmerizing. They draw you in and hold your gaze. That's likely due to the thick eyelashes and mascara we give them for emphasis, but most importantly, feminine allure. Notice how, now that we're looking at this lady's head from above, the shape of the eye has changed. It kind of straightens out along the top. It's not as curved. But then with the bottom eyelid, we see how that curve is steepened as it wraps around the eyeball. The eyebrow is also sitting much closer to the eye now. So why is that? Well, it's because of how the head is structured and the relationship between the brow line and eyes. The brow acts as a roof that hangs forward over the eyes to shield them from rain, sweat, dust, snow, sun, and anything else that could potentially irritate or damage our eyes. The eyes sit back inside the skull, and so looking at our lady head from above, the distance between the brow line and eye line becomes narrower. In fact, the higher we get, the shorter that distance is going to become. If we get high enough, the brow roof could potentially obscure the eyes altogether. This goes for anything that protrudes or recedes on the head at this angle. Anything protruding, such as the brow and tip of the nose, is going to sit lower. Anything receding will be pushed higher. It's an optical effect, but on a basic level, that's what's happening. Here's some other interesting things you'll notice. Whatever's sitting further back on the head, such as the ears or the corners of the jaw, they'll be raised along with the impressed facial features like the eyes and opening of the mouth that sit back inside the skull. Anything sitting forward, like the front of the face as a whole, for example, will be lowered. Essentially, we're distorting the head's geometry in perspective here. And I know it sounds real complicated, but actually it's not when you begin thinking back to that basic foundation we started off with. It's those basic forms that we're working off here, and that's really what we're attempting to put into perspective. As long as you keep the basic rules in mind for the top-down view, you're going to be fine. So let's go over a few of them before I start talking about the hair, because we'll have heaps of airtime for that since hair takes a fair while to render. Let's focus on the face itself for a moment and how the top-down perspective modifies its shape. Looking at the jawline, we can see that from this point of view, the corners of the jaw sit much higher than they would if we were observing the head at eye level. The corners of the jaw sit further back, so in this particular instance, they'll appear raised as the head turns downward. The chin sits forward, so what are we going to see as a result? The opposite effect. It's going to drop, elongating the distance between it and the corners of the jaw. As for the facial features, the underside of the nose is completely hidden in this viewpoint, so we only see the top bridge and side planes. Again, it'll drop down further toward the mouth. Like the brow, if we were to rotate it in an even more dramatic downward direction, the nose might very well completely overlap the mouth altogether. Now, the mouth in itself is interesting because it's in the upward and downward angles that we're able to get a better look at the cylindrical curve it follows. It doesn't travel across the face in a straight line. Instead, it bends around it. If you look in the mirror, open your mouth and tilt your head back or forth, you'll see that your teeth follow an arch, and so does the opening of the mouth. The more we tilt the head away from us, the more significant that arch is gonna get. In this example, we're looking at our beautiful lady head from above, so the mouth's curve will follow a downward arch, like a shallow U. So that's the opening of the mouth, but how are the lips drawn from this point of view? Well, we're going to see the same thing happen with the top lip that we saw with the underside roof of the brow. It'll become narrower. It's more hidden as the head tilts downward. The bottom lip, however, is more exposed. We see more of it. We're able to see more or less of the planes that make up these features depending on their angle, our point of view, and the perspective we're looking at them in. Alright, so we've talked about the features and the way they're affected when drawing the female head in the top-down perspective, but what about their placement? How are the proportions of the head and the proportional relationships between the features affected when we start applying perspective to it? We actually start to see some pretty significant changes there, and one might argue that everything we know about the proportions of the head becomes useless at this point because of that. That's not true. The proportions of the head are still well and truly intact. They're just foreshortened. In other words, as the head tilts away from us, the placement of the features begin to recede relative to their proportions. What does that mean? Well, it means that the face can still be broken up into thirds, with the brow line on the first third, nose on the second, and chin on the third. The bottom half of the face below the nose is still split into thirds to find the placement of the mouth too, except these measurements are all scaled according to the perspective. As the head angles away from us, the distance between the features contract. As it angles toward us, they expand. How does that apply to this lovely lady head in particular? Well, the top of the head will be bigger with a greater distance between the facial features, while toward the bottom, the face will become narrower and the distance between the features will get shorter. Look, we're getting all technical here, but don't overthink it. What we're seeing happen is essentially what would happen if you took a basic cube and tilted it on a downward angle. Use the basic head model to plot out the structure and proportions as best you can, then give it your best shot. What you'll find is that your natural intuition is going to kick in, and you'll be able to wing it while keeping what I have said here in the back of your mind. If you start to get too calculative and precious about nailing the exact proportions of the head according to the perspective you're drawing it in, your art is just going to look too manufactured. Use this stuff as a guide to help you when you need it. Use it to cross-check your work so that you can figure out where things might be going wrong, then address them. At the end of the day, you're an artist, not a mathematician, so give yourself some creative liberty here. At this point, this gal's hair is essentially blocked out and rendered to a fairly high degree of detail, so we'll save that explanation for the next example we'll go over here in a minute. With the drawing basically done though, it's time to go back over what we've done and add the garnish. I'm talking about those slick looking line weights and the subtle rendering that's really going to make this head pop off of the page. This is the easy part, and the fun part where we get to refine the drawing and give it that final polish. Okay, so specifically, how do we go about that? We're going to go over the top of the major outlines and darken them up, the surrounding contours of the face, ears, eyes, base of the nose and mouth. I want to emphasize the lines to get these areas of the drawing to stand out. Look, line weights are great for a lot of things, indicating light direction, adding variation to the thickness of your lines for visual interest and aesthetics, but by far the best thing they bring to the table is a sense of depth. At this stage, that's the number one thing at the top of our list of priorities, introducing as much depth to the drawing as possible. Cast shadows are great for this too. The only con is they're a pain to render. No matter how many times I've gone through this, I still have trouble composing the hatches inside my cast shadows. The reason for that, at least for me, is because unlike regular rendering, we're not really trying to describe form here as much as we're trying to indicate the shade of tone, because literally we're rendering the shade of one object being cast over another. In this case, that would be the cast shadow of this gal's head over the top of her neck. Now, that's not to say we don't want to indicate some sense of form at the same time. It's kind of a mix of both, but you really want to give the impression that this is a projected shadow that's being cast by another form, not the shadow of the form it's being cast upon. So I try to angle the hatching in a somewhat randomized direction within the cast shadow that still indicates whatever form it's blanketed over. It's a bit of a balance, and in all honesty, it comes down to aesthetics. If it looks right, it probably is right, but until that point comes, just erase and rework it as much as you need to. Okay, so we're back onto the hair now, and I'm pretty much doing with it what I've already done to the face. I'm emphasizing the major forms within the hair with some well-placed line weights. And make no mistake, hair certainly does take on and follow a form of its own. That's essentially what shapes its style, and we've got to describe it as visually as possible amid all that detail. Because without that emphasis, it can easily fall apart. The form hair takes on should be what the eye sees first. The texture, tone, and shading created within it are there as a complementary addition to help describe its shape. In fact, I think of all rendering besides cast shadows in the same way I think about most other surface details. Every hatch needs to follow the form to help describe its surface, texture, or material. If it doesn't, then the integrity of that form will be tarnished. It won't appear to be the shape it was intended to be, and it's so easy for hair to fall into the trap of becoming an unreadable mess due to an abundance of detail. Copious amounts of rendering is fine, but it's got to be balanced within the context of the major form it's being drawn within. For example, you can clearly see how this character's hair is shaped, how it flows, and how it's layered through the carefully contrasted light and dark tones created by the rendering. At the top, where the light is brightest, there's a minimal amount of rendering, whereas the underlying layers that are overlapped by the locks above have an increased level of rendering to darken their tone. Combined with the line weights I'm using to emphasize the separation within the hair, this makes it much more readable. It makes sense visually. What you're looking at is easily understood. All the while, I'm pushing the depth of the hair as well. It's got a real textural feel to it now. Truth be told, I went a little crazy on the hairdo for this one. Not sure what kind of vibe I was going for, maybe a wild punk chick that had a bit of an attitude. I got no idea. You can have a lot of fun styling the hair of your characters, that's for sure. Sometimes I don't really know what I'll come up with until I start blocking out a basic shape for a style I think might look cool. After you start breaking it up and defining the layering, even the most out there hairstyles usually come together pretty well. So you've got quite a bit of freedom, which is why I try to complement the overall aesthetics of the character with the hairstyle I choose for her. It's an extension to their design. Alright, thanks so much for watching. I hope that you got a ton of valuable information out of this demonstration. Again, if you'd like to see the full lesson and you found what you got out of this lesson valuable, please check it out on Skillshare by clicking the link below. I'm also going to put together a full course. I'm going to compile all these lessons that I've been putting out into a single package ultimately later on down the track, but until that point I'll be putting these lessons out on Skillshare so you can check them out before the official release of that course if you'd like to. If you're getting some value out of these lessons, then I highly encourage you to do that. But yeah, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you in the next lesson. Keep on practicing and keep on creating.